Good morning, everyone. You're listening to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
And Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
On Evidence of Design, we primarily critique income and wealth inequality. We forefront economic inequality in our discussions to raise awareness about why there is so much economic inequality and what effects it has on society. Our argument is that economic inequality isn't given enough attention in society, whether it's by the people in power, by the media, by anyone who's a gatekeeper or a powerful stakeholder. Economic inequality isn't given enough attention in our society because those people in power don't want us to know about it or think about it. Because those people in power want the economic system to stay the way that it is. And the way that it is basically us laboring away for relatively low pay and insecure benefits for their benefit. That's our argument. We'd love it whether you agree or disagree with us to participate in our show as we delve into controversial and complex things like income and wealth inequality. Yes, we do talk about social class. We do not find that a taboo topic. You're most welcome to participate by giving us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. We also have a Twitter handle and a Facebook page at Radio EOD, and you can also email us at any time at radioeod@gmail.com. As you probably guessed, the EOD stands for Evidence of Design. On today's show, we'll be talking about a number of things that have been in the news this week. This was a big week in the news. We had, of course, the Iowa caucuses on Monday night, or maybe it's the Iowa caucus. Well, there are probably caucuses that make up the caucus. We'll talk a little bit about what a caucus is and the results from the Iowa caucus. That was a huge deal because of the kind of big snafus that happened during the caucus and how the results were played out. And I think we're going to argue that the Democratic Party still seems to be actively lobbying against one of its own members, and that's Bernie Sanders. And it definitely seems like the Democratic Party is going through a civil war of ideas at this point, and I think that's profoundly influential. So we'll talk about the Iowa caucuses. We'll also, of course, we'll just mention the Trump acquittal. So Trump was acquitted by the U.S. Senate of his impeachment charges this week. And last night there was Democratic debate. So we're mainly focusing on sort of things in the news politically this week. But we'll talk also broader about why this stuff matters, right? So a lot of us are probably feeling fatigued right now of being in the middle of a presidential election cycle, which happens, it's like 2 years long in the United States. You know, there's basically always election cycles going on.
I feel like it's been longer than 2 years, to be honest. This one's been like since Trump was elected.
Yeah, I mean, John Delaney, I don't even know if he's still running, but John Delaney, who was on like the first one or two debate stages, had literally announced his candidacy for 2020 in like 2016. So.
Yeah, I think Trump did too. So.
Yeah, he's going beyond 2020 or 2024. Sad jokes. But yeah, so I hope we can get past that fatigue though, and just sort of have a good discussion about how we're feeling politically and where the country's going, because there's really deep-seated questions going on beyond sort of just like the media coverage of the politics. So that's where we're going today. One more time to remind you, we'd love to hear from you. 585-219-8889. This is live radio on 100.9 FM WXIR. It's Saturday, February 8th of 2020. Ready to take it away?
We're ready.
Let's do it.
I Think I Can by The Pillows.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. Let's talk about the Iowa caucuses this week. The Iowa caucuses are the first event in the presidential nominating cycle. Of course, every 4 years the pageantry rolls out, and there's all these news articles on why is Iowa the first state in the nation, and should this be changed, and this and that. And then, our election season ends and everyone's like, they don't care anymore. The same thing with the Electoral College. There's going to be a million news articles written about the Electoral College as November approaches, and then it'll happen, and one candidate or the other could get screwed over, and then no one will talk about it anymore. And so here we are talking about the Iowa caucuses, but we're not going to sort of do the pageantry of it. We'd like to explain a little bit about what a caucus is and what the results are from it. So I'll just quickly start with the results. And of course, Donald Trump won the Republican caucus, and he won the delegates in Iowa from the caucuses. He has two opponents and defeated both of them.
Republican opponents.
Two Republican opponents, right. So Donald Trump won 100% of the delegates there. No surprise. The Republican Party has become Donald Trump's party. I think that if 4 years ago we were to try to analyze that, I think most people wouldn't have said that would have ever happened. But right now, the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party of Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush or even Ronald Reagan. We are in the future of American society and history, for all intents and purposes that we can see. This is Trump's Republican Party now, and whereas we've lived in Reagan's party since the 80s, since 2016, that Republican Party no longer exists, and it's Trump's party now. So these old sort of cliches of Republicans as being fiscally conservative and hawkish on militarism, they don't necessarily apply anymore. And so it's Trump's party. Trump, is easily carrying his base. He's easily carrying the vast majority of Republicans, whether or not they pinch their nose and say, well, we don't like his character, but they like what he does. It doesn't matter. You're still voting for the guy, so therefore you're supporting him, both his character and his policies. And the Republican Party is Trump's party, and we see that in polling and so on and so forth. On the Democratic side, it's a lot more up in the air because I mentioned at the top of the hour that the Democratic Party is kind of going through what I would call a bit of a civil war, of course, with the more there's a wing of the Democratic Party that thinks that we just need to go back to how things were before 2016 with the Obama coalition or the Bill Clinton coalition. There's that part of the party that's like, let's just restore things. And then there's another part of the Democratic Party that says we can't just go back to how things were because they weren't great then anyways, right? They weren't any grand halcyon days.
They'll claim that part of the reason why Trump was able to get elected was because the sort of status quo under the Obama years, under the Clinton years, was unsatisfactory for so many people.
Precisely. And I personally tend to find that argument very convincing, that, like, why do we want to go back to a system that was fundamentally broken to begin with? And I sort of agree with the argument that Donald Trump never gets elected if certain big issues are resolved on the political stage from either Democrats or Republicans. And I think Democrats in particular, Republicans, I would argue, of course, are the most sort of carry a lot of the responsibility when it comes to a broken economic system. And I think this would, I think many voters hearing me say that would disagree with me, because Republicans have been very effective at branding themselves as the ones who are knowledgeable and strong about the economy. I think that is so far from the truth, and that in fact it's Democrats who have the much stronger economic policies. But I think their policies too have been weak for so long, particularly from the 70s and 80s, the Reagan era, that the reason why we're in such a mess as we are today, both politically and economically, is because of a failure of both parties to meaningfully address alternatives to the economic realities that we've been living in. And so there are candidates in the Democratic Party nowadays, notably Bernie Sanders, and to somewhat a little less to extent Elizabeth Warren, but still with a main argument that, like, look, we need to fundamentally reshape our political and economic system if we want our country to go better. This is very different than a candidate like Joe Biden, who's like, yo, just bring me back to the 2008 days, man, with my coalition with Obama, and I'm not sure that's the most convincing argument, and it seems like voters in Iowa thought the same way. So getting to those results in Iowa, after lots of different issues with the reporting, Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders came out on top, essentially tied. Pete Buttigieg came out with one more pledged delegate than Bernie Sanders, but they're essentially tied at 26% of pledged delegates. So it was a tie, and polls seem to indicate that, where Pete Buttigieg was polling very high, several months ago, and then right before the Iowa caucus, Bernie Sanders was projected to win there. And so both kind of came out on top.
I believe Bernie Sanders actually won the popular vote.
Indeed. So Bernie Sanders did win the popular vote. He had 2,500 more people voting for him than Pete Buttigieg, but we live in a democratic system where popular votes don't matter all that much. We've seen that with the Electoral College and also with things like the Caucus. And so although Bernie Sanders won the popular vote, i.e. more human beings chose Bernie Sanders compared to any other candidate, he still didn't finish with the most pledged delegates. Mary, would you like to provide some context about what a caucus is and like delegates and why the heck we're talking about any of this in terms of Iowa and people voting on who to pick for the next Democratic nominee for the president?
I actually, one thing that I would like to sort of give a visual on is what a caucus looks like. Because, to be honest, until Wednesday, I didn't really know what a caucus was. I didn't know, because, you know, in New York, we just go to a polling place, go into a voting booth, mark down the people we're voting for and put it in a machine. And that's how our primary happens. And that's how we choose who we are nominating for the primary. That's not what happens in Iowa, and it's a much more involved process and a much more physical process, which I thought was kind of cool, but it's very different. So I just want to give a quick overview as to what the caucus looks like, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, because they don't happen the same way. So the information that I'm going to be reading, and I'm going to be reading from a website, it's from the Iowa Farm Bureau. And this is a resource that's for Iowans, particularly Iowans who are looking to caucus maybe for the first time. So it's a very introductory explanation meant for people who are actually going to be going to the caucus. So first, they mention the Democratic caucus. So funnily enough, on the website, they say the Democratic process is a bit more complicated than the Republican process, which we've seen, and obviously seeing the results, we can kind of infer that anyway. So in Democratic caucuses, after given an opportunity to speak on behalf of a favored candidate, participants physically move into different parts of the room to show which candidate they support. The size of the candidate's support is counted, and candidates who don't have enough support are deemed non-viable. The viability threshold is 15% of the participants in the room. So if a candidate doesn't have 15% of the people in the room, then those people, so the members of the non-viable groups, can try to attract more people to their candidate, or they can disperse and join other candidates' groups, or they can remain uncommitted. The number of votes each candidate gets determines what percentage of that precinct's delegates will represent that person at the county convention. And I believe there are about 1,600 precincts in Iowa. So this happens a lot of times in Iowa, on Monday night. Because of this process, it becomes very important for Democratic campaigns to not only line up supporters of their candidates, but also try to identify the second choice of each caucus attendee in case their first choice is deemed not viable.
And I believe that in some of the coverage that I was aware of leading up to this, there were many comments made by candidates who, a lot of them were like for Elizabeth Warren, for example, was saying things like, you know, I'm a fan of Bernie Sanders. We've been friends for. I'm speaking sort of like parenthetically. I don't remember the actual quote that she said, but she was making, and not just her as well, but many candidates will make plays toward other parties, especially candidates who are expected to not fare as well because of this second round of caucusing that occurs. If a candidate does not make the threshold, there is still an opportunity for somebody who's perhaps doing a little bit better but not as good as the leading candidates to sort of scoop up those votes.
Yeah, it's something that separates a caucus process very harshly from a primary process, where in our primary process in New York State, you vote for one candidate. You know, one person, one vote, one candidate. Very different in the Iowa caucus as you're describing, Matt, and that's why it's very important people's second choices. Because, you sort of these broad coalitions are built to scoop up people. And so there's a lot of analysis done right now. Like if Warren and Sanders voters were combined and Buttigieg, Biden, and Klobuchar voters were combined, who would come out on top? Because where we are right now in the democratic process, it seems like those two camps are going to emerge. Of course, a lot of things can change, and it's not as easy as that, but it is a very interesting exercise to have. And my last point before, Mary, I turn it back to you, is that there are efforts out there to have ranked choice voting systems.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's going on in Maine or something, but so there are efforts out there to come up with a better voting process where you do take into account like top 1 to 3 or 4 choices or something, and that will appropriate votes differently. And I think, there's really interesting arguments for or against that. But it's just nice to have this conversation, say, like, there are different ways to go about democracy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't know how many different ways there were. So, so I do want to briefly touch just on the Republican caucus as well, just to show that it is different and how that works. So this one is a little bit more straightforward. So once you are in your precinct and your precinct meeting has been called to order, usually the chair of your caucus will invite anyone to speak briefly in support of their favorite candidate. Once all speeches have concluded, each eligible voter in the caucus will be given a piece of paper to either write or mark their choice. After everyone has filled out their secret ballot, the votes are counted in the precinct and announced to the room. All the precincts of a county are collected by party leadership and then reported to the Republican Party of Iowa to tabulate the state results. So in this case, they actually do use an unofficial secret ballot, which is then announced to the room. Whereas in the Democratic caucus, you are physically voting with your body. Everyone knows who you're voting for. Everyone knows where in the room you are.
Right.
But in the Republican caucus, everything is secret, and so you just write it down on a piece of paper. No one knows who you're voting for. I mean, in this case, everyone pretty much knew who you were voting for. But but then just to make a note of who. So what is the point of having a caucus and voting for these candidates? So both parties conduct caucuses on the same night all throughout Iowa. In the precinct caucus, again, this is from the Iowa Farm Bureau, this is the ultimate grassroots function of Iowa politics, and it is where one is elected to a leadership position in one's county party. So not statewide, not nationwide, but in the county. And it is the first step to becoming a delegate to the county, district, state, or national convention. And it is also where changes to the party's platform are introduced.
So there's a lot of talk about, pros and cons of the Iowa caucus and why does Iowa go first, and is this the last time that Iowa will go first in the presidential nominating cycle?
I'm not sure, and maybe this is something that we can just discuss or you can help me understand, but I don't know why states do this at different times. Like, I don't know why we don't all just have one day where everyone nationwide votes for the delegates for their county.
I'm not entirely sure. I think I used to know, but I know that states lobby to try to have their primaries at an earlier time because, Iowa gets a ridiculous amount of attention for this, right? Iowa is a relatively small state in the middle of the country. Its population trends older, it trends white, and they get all this attention to give candidates a huge gust of wind behind their back into the nominating cycle. I think New Hampshire's next. It's Tuesday of next week or something. So
the date was last night.
Yep. So New Hampshire's coming right up, and I don't know why we have just one universal thing, Mary. But I do know that all of these caucuses or primaries are set by the states' own parties. So in order to change these things, it would have to go through the states themselves or be in coordination with the national party chairs. So, of course, Tom Perez is the chair of the Democratic Party on the national stage, and he sent out a pretty, I don't know, I won't sensationalize it, but he sent out a tweet this week that was basically like, Iowa, you got to do a recanvass of all your votes. And there's a lot of talk about, are we done with Iowa?
I heard a lot of people framing the sort of, we haven't really gotten to this yet, but there were, as I assume at least some people are aware of, there was some difficulties in the reporting of the caucuses for the Democratic Party, at least on, it was Tuesday night, right?
Yep.
Tuesday. At least in large part because the party this time decided to rely on an app to report those results, which was developed by a company called Shadow, which is a very interesting name for any kind of company that's involved in politics. Shadow being a company that was sort of founded by a number of former Clinton and Obama operatives. We don't need to go too much into that.
Yeah.
But essentially what ended up happening was the app wasn't... it hadn't been really tested on the sort of level that it was going to be utilized in this caucus, and as a result, there were difficulties in reporting results. And in addition to that, the phone line, apparently, that is traditionally used to report caucus results was also having difficulties. So it took a lot longer, and by longer I mean a couple days, and in the course of a news cycle, that is a long time. But the sort of response by a lot of people, or maybe not a lot of people, but the response that I saw was that there were people framing this sort of fiasco as a catastrophe. Literally the word catastrophe was used. And I thought that was perhaps a bit extreme just in this, for what it was, but I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts.
Maybe they just need one giant shared Google Doc. And then everyone puts in their number.
Matt, I'd love to get to that after reminding folks that you're tuned into 100.9 FM WXIR and you're listening to Evidence of Design. We're talking about several things in the news this week: the Iowa caucuses, the State of the Union address, impeachment, the impeachment and acquittal, the Democratic debate last night, and then we'll get to a piece by the UN Secretary General, a really interesting thing that he wrote this week. But so, Matt, you just described a lot of the issues that went along with the Iowa caucus this week, and just all these sort of snafus that rose up, and I do think it warrants the sort of disaster language, the sort of sensational language that you just brought up, because we are going. So okay, so this is the point of today's show, is to bring all this context into the week in the news, right? So we are going into the most important presidential election in a long time. And I don't think that's exaggerated, right? All elections matter, but I think this one in particular, November, really matters for the integrity of the future of our institutions as a country. It really matters. We just, the Republican-controlled Senate just acquitted the president who has been accused of trying to rig the 2020 election in his favor by soliciting foreign interference into our election against one of his domestic political rivals. The Senate just found him not guilty of trying to rig the 2020 election. There are arguments out there that let voters decide in 2020 who should win. The issue with that argument is that we no longer live in a world or system where our elections are free and fair. I'm willing to make that statement. Our elections are at serious risk of not being free and fair. At least that statement, right? In 2016, we saw Russia's interference in our election through social media. We're seeing Trump trying to interfere in our elections. He solicited foreign interference before from China. And so we just went through this Iowa caucus that was not great in terms of getting people to trust the process, right? The last thing you want is to voters in a democratic society to not trust the process through which democracy happens. And so this is really bad because it seems like, in this instance in Iowa, that there was no foreign interference, there was no malicious hacking, it was just incompetence. It was just bumbling. It was just the use of an app that somehow Pete Buttigieg has a relationship with that brings up a lot of questions and conspiracy theories. We're living in through such a nervous and scary time that you want to take away all of those doubts for people, right? So my hope coming out of Iowa, having all of these issues happen, is that people really wake up and get their act together to try to ensure the integrity of our elections. Mitch McConnell has famously voted down proposals to strengthen our election laws since 2016. The Federal Election Commission is toothless and has not been appointed to have a full board. And so we've essentially changed nothing since 2016, and in fact we're even more ill-prepared, I believe, to have our elections truly be free and fair. And so, again, this sort of important background context, I think that, these issues that happened in Iowa through the use of an app and a bad phone system and inconsistent reporting of results, it does matter because we need to be having as many arguments as possible and people on board to bring people together to say, free and fair elections do have integrity in this country.
I think one point, though, about this very emergency-style language is that when you use words that are so extreme, such as catastrophe, which are usually used for like natural disasters or things where a lot of people die, is that often that word is associated with sort of a sense of helplessness, where it's like, oh no, this thing happened. It's so sad. We can't do anything about it, though. And I think in this case, it may not be appropriate language because of that feeling, because it sort of, makes you feel like this is just how it is and that sucks and we kind of have to deal with it. And I think that it would be more appropriate to have language that is, maybe a little bit more formal, that makes us feel that we can change it. Yeah.
I think that is a fair point. Obviously, the media, and we are a part of the media, being on a radio show, we have a lot of power in the words that we say, and I have person versus self conflicts all the time with the words that are coming out of my mouth. And this is a live radio show, and so I don't have the luxury of preparing. I don't have the luxury of being as careful as I would like, as if we were a podcast or a pre-recorded show. So, Mary, I definitely sort of see that point, and I agree with it. Maybe to go with that point, there's arguments that after the Democrats have tried impeachment and that has failed, how can you ever raise a bar again to try to get impeachment against Trump when he does commit more sort of heinous crimes against our institutions? And so I really do see that argument. And I guess the hope each time is that people will rise to the occasion and see the issues for what they are. Right? I mean, climate change is another one. We're like, how loud do you have to be about climate change until you commit people to take action? And we've seen for decades that it doesn't work all that well, And so I don't know where to stand on this. I go back and forth all the time between trying to rage and scream and yell sort of as I watch things that I hold dear, sort of what I see light on fire and burn, versus taking a more calm, rational approach, trying to get people to understand where I'm coming from, my point of view, and getting them on board so that we can all fight for a world that we all want to live in because it's better for everyone. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Well, I think that personally I was a bit turned off by the usage of a word like catastrophe, because in going along with what Mary said about how it's often used to frame, or to describe rather, something as horrific as a natural disaster, it just felt a bit insensitive in terms of it being used to describe what happened in Iowa. But I appreciate your framing of it, Jason, in that this is a very critical moment in not just our history, but in the sort of state of our institutions, the faith that the citizenry has in the democratic process, and that essentially whenever I read the news or listen to the news or watch the news, I always am hoping to find that level of nuance. Skip the headlines, the sound bites that are prepared to sort of condense something as sort of important and again nuanced as the election process into and sort of like, I'm sort of losing track of what I was saying here, but I want that long discussion.
I think this brings up a question that maybe we weren't prepared to talk about today, but I think talking about all of this, and I kind of don't want to get any more into semantics about the word catastrophe, but I think that is an interesting, very specific example about the question of how do we get other people to feel like things matter. And it sounds like from what you're saying, Jason, like that's something that you're struggling with is, seeing these institutions and finding them to have a lot of importance and realizing that a lot of people don't see that or don't care. And, how can we make people want to care? And the same thing with the elections. Like, one thing we didn't mention in Iowa is what was the voter turnout? What percentage of Iowans went to caucus? As we talk a lot about the results and how many people went, and showed up for candidates, but as we've also mentioned in the democratic process, at least, you have to like really be committed to your candidate to show up and physically put your body in support of that candidate.
That's intimidating.
It's very intimidating, and it makes much fewer people turn out. And even in New York, where our process is secret and you show up for 3 minutes and put in your ballot,
some people don't even have time for that.
Yeah, a fraction of the population votes. So how can we as media or as a society get people to show up for the processes?
It doesn't help that there are politicians, elected politicians in our government whose political strategy is to disenfranchise as many voters as possible.
Certainly.
Their re-election depends on that sort of policy.
Yeah, I always tell people who say that, my vote doesn't count. I'm just one vote. I'm like, if your vote doesn't count, why do so many people work so hard to make sure that you can't vote to begin with? Because they're afraid of you.
I saw something recently, which was I don't remember. It was something on the internet, but it was along the lines of just, thinking about impeachment where, now Trump has been acquitted of crimes, and that's disappointing. However, had we not voted, in the midterm election, and the House had been turned over, we never would have been having that process in the first place. Mm-hmm. There would have been no impeachment process. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who will argue that that's correct. However, this brings a lot of things to light. Whether or not he's acquitted, he has had to go through this process. And had we not had a Democratic House, that would not have happened. So your vote does matter in every election. Mm-hmm. Which is hard, sometimes to see when we're looking at the Iowa caucus and Sanders has the majority of the popular vote but is not leading. It's hard to see that, but it is still important to be one of those people and to get everyone to come out and vote or caucus or whatever it may be in your community.
Mm. Yeah, to get back to your question, though, that I think is really important, Mary, is like, how do you get people involved in the process? I know for me, I was never into politics when I was younger. I remember like going into my brother's room, and he'd always be watching the news, and he was in high school at the time, and I'm younger than my brother, so I just remember being like, why the heck are you watching the news? I mean, let's watch Yu-Gi-Oh or something. I don't know. And so I just like never understood politics until I got into the end of my high school career. I was taking a lot of advanced history courses, and then I went into college and I was taking a lot of courses related to politics, and I suddenly had sort of the tools in my tool belt, so to speak, to make sense of the things going on in the world around me. I think I might be rambling here, but I think in general we have a very poor political and historical education in the United States. And I'm not trying to critique anything or bring everything down or whatever. I don't have a solution to this, but I do generally think, if only 30% of our population has a bachelor's degree or higher, and most people are leaving high school with just 70% of the population just has a high school diploma. I do know that the sorts of education you get out of high school, while useful, is not enough to like carry you on in a civil society where you can be as productive or informed as you might like. And of course, you don't need to hold advanced degrees to be educated or whatever. I understand that. I'm just sort of saying that like we all need to somehow in our society keep having political education so that we can make better sense of the world around us. And that's very hard when we live in a society where we are sort of forced to labor for so many hours for so little pay with such precarity. And thankfully, for me at least, my lens, my tinted glasses that I see the world through, connects the dots to be like, wait a second, there's a very clear connection between disenfranchisement of voters, between big money in politics, between lobbyists in Washington who want corporate power, and sort of all the issues that we're talking about right now. So for me, I get very passionate about politics because I'm seeing issues in the world that make sense to me, and I sort of am energized about how to go about tackling them. And that, in a nutshell, is getting money out of politics, right? And stopping people like the Koch brothers from donating literally billions of dollars into advertisements and organizing and policy circles and think tanks and white papers and speeches and essays and so on and so forth that gets in the mind of voters.
And on the other hand, I think, getting money out of politics, but also putting money into institutions that will allow everyday voters to have the time to think about it and maybe frees up other concerns. For example, universal health care, free college, which are things that are in some ways on the ballot this election. And, you mentioned that this is one of the most important elections in recent history. And I think that's one of the reasons why, is because it brings in it questions these institutions that have been gaining power for so long and gaining financial power. And these are some things that inhibit voters. Like, if you're worried about medical bills, you are not going to be caring about politics unless it's because you're trying to vote in a system that will help you. If you are, drowning in student loan debt, and we've had episodes on that specific issue, that's going to be your main concern, and you're not going to be concerned about politics. So I think on the other hand, we have propaganda to some degree, to many degrees, and also on the voting end, we don't have the time or the energy to put into thinking about politics and questioning things. So we have, both of these struggles.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about something you brought up, Jason, and maybe this is a little too personal to go into, but you were talking about how when you were younger, your brother was at least interested in the news, perhaps even politically minded, while you weren't. But you would have been very young at the time, probably even in middle school. It sort of got me thinking about my own upbringing, and that I feel in many ways, and this is not meant to be sort of bashing my parents or anything, but that my sort of the awakening of my political interest happened in spite of sort of the influence of my, family, rather than because of it. Growing up, I didn't really have the sense that my parents were too interested in politics. Whenever the topic was breached, it was often just to describe it how corrupt the system was, and how nothing ever seemed to get done. And I think that it was probably the way. Well, they were probably that way because they were already sort of skeptical of the democratic process to begin with, because they were already on some level disenfranchised, even though my family is white and securely middle class, and in all honesty has probably benefited from the policies of this nation over the last 50 to 100 years, more than a lot of people belonging to other ethnic groups, other classes. And I can't say that I have known people personally. I might have. I haven't spoken to them about it. But I have never really had a conversation with somebody who sort of had an upbringing that was explicitly political. But I have read articles by people who have described their childhoods talking about how their parents brought them up to be politically minded. And I think that sort of my own experience can only speak to the sort of pervasiveness of how effective sort of the idea, the narrative to get people to be as politically inactive as possible has become.
That's powerful. And another reminder to folks that you're tuned into 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is Evidence of Design, and you can give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. Matt, to go off what you were saying about sort of political education and when you come into politics or how people are kept out of politics, I always remember something that my high school participation in government teacher told us. And it wasn't sort of a big speech he was making. It was sort of an offhand comment. But he said, in referencing students in the class who in their senior year of high schools were not sort of into politics or didn't like politics or thought themselves apolitical, he said that everyone is going to have an issue in their life where they're going to realize that politics matters. And he's like, you will know when it comes, and I know that there are several moments in my life. I don't know what my first one was, but I do think that everyone will suddenly, have a political awakening at some point. So there's that sort of politics where it's like, wait, this sort of spark lights onto you when you get a passion that you realize that you can affect through the political system. But I also, personally, I think everything is politics, and there's no such thing as being apolitical.
Right.
If you go to a restaurant and you don't get a styrofoam container for your food because you're worried about the environment, that's politics.
Or if you don't even think about it.
Or if you don't think about it, precisely. Yeah, that's even more powerful.
I think that's probably the more important one, because that's the one that, is more prevalent as, I don't have time for politics, I'm not into politics, but that, that choosing to not vote is, that is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in some cases, as we've mentioned, it is not a choice made willingly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're not voting because you can't, and there's a lot of stuff to unpack there with voting issues and incarceration. A lot to unpack, but a choice not to vote, if you are able to, is a very powerful political choice. Exactly.
Yeah. If I can share, this has popped in my mind. There's a quote from someone known as Frantz Fanon. He was an anti-colonial writer, I believe in French-controlled parts of Africa, I believe. And this quote just always stuck in my head, where he wrote something to the effect of, it is commonly thought with criminal flippancy that to politicize the masses means haranguing them with a major political speech. But to politicize the masses, but a political education means to open up the mind, to awaken the mind, and to invent the souls of men. And so if you can forgive his gendered language at the end there of men, I really think that quote was very powerful, because politics isn't about someone standing behind a podium. That is, of course, a very large part of it, but a political education is about inventing who we are as a people and who you are as a person. And that quote, to me, I always go to when I need to have a definition for politics of people. This is very powerful, and it's why it matters. It's why all of this matters.
If we could continue to speak a little more offhand about this for just a moment longer, I recall being so amazed by the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas with how they were able to organize themselves and sort of build a movement. They had a lot of help with attention from the media, but they were incredibly effective at sort of garnering that attention to begin with, and using the sort of tragedy that they had all experienced as a platform to discuss a much larger issue. And I recall thinking that, and I still feel this way, that if the same thing had happened at our school, Jason, never would have happened. I cannot imagine our student body building the same sort of response to that. And I don't think, and I think I recall that Marjory Stoneman Douglas was a more affluent school.
This is the school shooting in Florida that happened 2 or 3 years ago.
3 years ago, yeah.
And that civic and political education was very much an important part of their curriculum. And I think that sort of like the response that those children had to that tragedy is all the evidence that one should need in order to determine how important that education was.
Yeah, that was really powerful as that was going on, and seeing those students participate in their activism. And of course, it still continues today as they continue to be involved, even with less media coverage. Perhaps for our final 10 minutes here, just reminding folks one more time that you can give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. Perhaps we should talk about, I want to pose a question to the both of you, and whether or not you agree or disagree with me. Sure. Not just because the purpose of our show is on economic inequality, but I think that going throughout the rest of this political cycle of who the next president will be, and also, of course, there's other people on the ballot in 2020, but we just sort of talk about the president because it's in America, as much as we don't like kings and queens, apparently we tend to infatuate our executive branch. But I think that the key that we need to make, we as in people who want to affect a society that is better for the vast majority of the human beings who reside within it, need to be making more effective arguments about the economics. So President Trump gave his State of the Union address this week, of course, before he was acquitted by the legislative branch, by the Senate. And in his message, he spent a considerable amount of time touting his economic record. He said that we have the lowest unemployment in the history of our nation for so long. We have X number of jobs that are created. We have the stock markets are soaring, so on and so forth. And I think that will be I think that's a very effective message for Trump to make. I don't agree with it. I don't buy it, but I think that will resonate a lot with a ton of voters, particularly those who are like, yeah, I don't like Trump's character, but he's great on the economy. I completely disagree that he's great on the economy. I would love to have a conversation with anyone. It's easier to have that conversation with someone who can pose questions who disagrees with you than it is for me to sort of pontificate about it. So I'd love to sort of politely debate someone on that. But let me get to my point. I want to ask you, Matt and Mary, like, what would you say are the reasons why the economy may not be so strong as Trump would argue? What sort of arguments would you like to see a politician make for a better economy?
I know personally that we see so much focus and attention drawn to unemployment, to the fact that, for example, right now the unemployment rate is something hovering at like 3% or something. Yeah,
3 point whatever percent.
And there's always the promise of more jobs to be coming. But we have so much, while we have all this attention on like this quantity of jobs that we are trying to fulfill, there seems to be very little attention placed on sort of the quality of lives that people are living. Like, if I'm working 3 jobs, if I'm having to work 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, I guess technically I am surviving and I don't have to worry about having a job. Potentially. I mean, that there's more issues to go into there. But that's not necessarily how I personally want to be living my life. I mean, why is it that we have to spend so much of our time laboring over things that often don't matter that much to us, when there are people who control vast amounts of wealth who don't need to put in an honest in air quotes, work in order to survive? Why is it that the value of a person's character, the sort of substance of who they are in this country, is so often tied to the labor that they perform? These are questions that I find myself asking all the time and sort of struggling with. And I think that there is a more equitable solution. I think that there's a more humane solution where people could be working less and have more time to focus on the things that matter to them, their hobbies, their passions, their families. That's all I have right now.
I want to agree with that and sort of reference the conversation that we had last week about the use of technology in labor and how that's changing the face of labor. And what we're often seeing right now is that it's changing the face of labor by making people into, I don't want to use the word slaves to machines, but, you know, it's taking away people's ability or necessity to use their brain power in their work, and that lowers the quality of work when you're not challenged and not interested, and you're not able to choose what time or any of the things that you, well, I guess you have no like ownership over your life, basically. And I guess I would just, agree that if we are going to have a strong economy, that should bring with it a strong quality of life for the people of this nation, citizens or not. That should also mean that if we have a strong economy, we can provide for all of those people, not only in meaningful work that allows them to have a good quality of life, but in solid health through healthcare, in a meaningful and solid education. And I do not believe that we are providing those things right now for every person in this country, which to me means that we do not have a strong economy.
If I could just bounce off that, Mary, we talked about this a little bit last week when we had our discussion on automation and labor, but we know that technology is sort of advancing at an exponential rate with each passing year, and we know that automation has replaced a lot of sort of jobs just in the past 10 years, and I think the point that I want to make is that it is not inconceivable, it is even imaginable that at some point, I don't know when that day is, but at some point there will be a system, a robot, a device that can perform and serve in any capacity that a human can. And at that point, we were going to have real discussions, or hopefully before then we can have real discussions about what that means when so much of our sort of conception of what it means to be an active citizen is tied into what we do to earn a living.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And so my point in going through this exercise is to say that I think that if you're a progressive or a liberal or democratic person or someone who looks at society and is not happy with how things are going, we're going to need to be a lot better at winning the economic argument because we're not doing a great job at it so far. And so I think there are candidates, if not a candidate out there who's making a very effective argument about issues with the economy. And so if people are paying attention to those sorts of things, I think that we need to be much stronger about that. And I don't think we have to look too far, actually, to know kind of the directions that we're going. But I do know that direction is not saying the stock market is better and that we have more jobs. That is simply not enough, given the things that both of you just said. We're going to have to end the hour there, though, on 100.9 FM WXIR. This was Evidence of Design. You can always find our past episodes on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design channel. Be specific with your search. Search for something like Evidence of Design, episode 1 through 81, and it'll pop up for you. We're always live here on 100.9, Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. I was your host, Jason Taylor, joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Goodbye.
And Mary Lawrence.
Be well.
Until next time, be well, be safe, stay informed, and bye-bye.